It's Tuesday, the 27th of September. This is Politics Live from the Labour Party conference in Liverpool. Joining me today, Keir Starmer's former Director of Communications, Ben Nunn, The Sun's Kate Ferguson, Shadow Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds and Professor of Politics at Oxford University, Jane Green. Today,
there is a confidence, there's a seriousness and there's a conviction we're ready for government.
But what would a Labour government do to instil confidence in the UK economy?
It now costs the UK more to borrow 10 years, the UK government, than Italy or Greece, who we've traditionally thought of as being, well, not quite basket cases.
As the Chancellor and Bank of England Governor try to calm the markets, what do higher government borrowing costs mean for the rest of us?
That's carried.
Delegates opt to change the voting system, but would it help Labour win general elections? Hello and welcome to the first of two special Politics Live programmes from the Labour Party conference here in Liverpool. We are, of course, expecting Sir Keir Starmer to give his second in-person speech to the Labour Party conference and delegates gathered here in a couple of hours' time. Let's have a look at him here, putting the finishing touches to that speech. We're told that Keir Starmer is going to channel his inner Tony Blair, echoing the former Labour Prime Minister's claim that the party was the political wing of the British people ahead of that landslide election for Labour in 1997. But there'll be people here who voted for Keir Starmer in that leadership election 2 years ago who may have done so because they thought he was the heir to Jeremy Corbyn rather than Tony Blair. At the time, Keir Starmer had said that the 2017 Labour manifesto, one of Jeremy Corbyn's, was his foundational document. So my opening question, starting with you, Ben, is who is the real Keir Starmer?
I think Keir... Look, let's start from the principle of what Keir inherited 2 or 3 years ago. He inherited a Labour Party that was busted. It was broken and it was rotten from the core. 2 years on, there is now a serious prospect that he's going to win the next general election and form the next government. And that is an extraordinary turnaround, which frankly, if I'd been, well, I was saying this a couple of years ago and people laughed at me. So it's an extraordinary turnaround. I think what people are going to see from Keir is, today in particular, is his clear priorities for the next government, which is about fixing the economy, getting the economy growing again, delivering on the green agenda, opportunities for everyone. I think that's what we're going to see from the conference this week.
So shunning the ideology that he said would be the foundational document of his leadership from the Jeremy Corbyn era.
I think the principles of what Keir stands for have never changed, but it is worth remembering what has happened since Keir got elected. We've had a global pandemic, we've had a war in Europe, and we've got the worst economic crisis in a generation. He's got to respond to the current crises, built on the principles and values that he set out in the leadership contest, but with a realistic, credible plan that can take us into government.
Who do you think the real Keir Starmer is, Kate?
Well, I think the real Keir Starmer is probably a quite cautious moderate. So yes, as you point out, he did stand on this quite leftist manifesto to appeal to as many people as possible. But in my opinion, you're probably a little naive if you thought that he was going to continue the Corbynista era.
What about you, Jonathan? How would you describe Keir Starmer for today in 2022?
Well, I would describe him as the next Prime Minister of the UK. This is the best Labour Party conference I've ever been to, and I've been to quite a few. Oh, I should have foreseen that question. It's about 20, I think, actually more than that on the whole. But look, the atmosphere here is fantastic. The spirit of unity and wanting to win is fantastic. I'm also seeing a lot of our business engagement. We cannot get rooms big enough for the interest that we have got. And just on what Keir stands for. Look, Keir is promising people a long-term plan for growth and prosperity, more security in the workplace, a stronger role for trade unions and economic policy. We are talking about public services being rejuvenated. We're talking about dealing with the climate crisis. I think that was what he was putting forward to Labour Party members when he was elected, and he has delivered on
but
that.
are they getting what they voted for back in 2020?
Yes, I think so. They wanted someone who could be a Labour Prime Minister, first and foremost. That was what they wanted. And they wanted someone who could not only be the Prime Minister, but do it for the right reasons, do it for the things that they believed in, to be an alternative to the Conservative Party. And he is delivering in a way, on a scale, which even some of us who are very close to him perhaps wouldn't even believe were possible back in 2019, which was still an incredibly difficult experience.
All right, and we will interrogate a little bit about this economic competence and also going for growth, echoing what the government says.
Well, they're echoing us, it's just that we've got a plan,
all right,
and theirs has already failed.
We'll see who said it first. Jane, as a political scientist, Tony Blair was an election-winning machine during those years, but it's been a very long time since Labour won an election.
Absolutely.
Do you think Keir Starmer can emulate, on the basis of what you've seen and the polling you've done, can emulate any of that from the 2000s?
It's just such an interesting comparison because we've got a really different context. You know, we've got on the one hand the two elections, 2017, 2019, where we saw a real change in the electorate, a different pattern of support and a different context for Labour to try and fight the next election. Is it going to persist? Is that kind of pattern of support that we saw in the last election, is that going to persist? It's a very different context that Keir Starmer has to navigate. But whilst it's true that in 2019 the Conservatives won this huge majority, it's also true that by the next election they'll have been in power for 14 years potentially, and that's normally very bad news for an incumbent government. And of course they presided over what now starts to feel like crisis after crisis.
Yeah.
Let's have a look at the Times headline here in terms of polling. Labour surges in polls as clown show economics turns off voters. This, of course, is in the wake of that statement made by Kwasi Kwarteng on Friday. But is there a sense, Jane, again from the polling you've done, that this is really on the back of the Conservatives and their performance rather than a proactive winning over people from Labour?
So you've seen
you've
seen some people move from the Conservatives to the Labour Party. You've seen some of that switching, and you'd expect that because many of those Labour to Conservative voters were sort of traditional Labour identifiers. They were lending their vote to the Conservatives in 2019, so you'd expect them to be more inclined to go back to the Labour Party. But you've also seen lots of people undecided. So you've seen Conservative voters in 2019 undecided now. Now that doesn't tell you that the Labour Party yet has convinced people of who it's representing. You know, who are the voters that Labour wants to represent? Do people see that? Do people feel that? And then throw into that context increasing economic insecurity and potentially a loss of Conservative competence on the economy.
Give us a sense of the scale of that poll, because it puts Labour 17 points ahead. I mean, it's quite significant.
And this is what Labour needs to do. So Labour, if Labour's going to have a majority in the next election, they need to be polling at this kind of level. So this is the first poll, and of course there's only one poll so far. We'll have to wait to see what happens over the coming weeks. But it's the first poll that really puts Labour back into the majority territory, and I think they'll obviously have lots to celebrate in terms of that, but it's early days.
Your reaction, because it is just one poll. I've heard various of your colleagues saying, we're not complacent. Of course you're not complacent. But do you feel now there has to be a gear change towards what Labour is setting out, not just to people here in the conference hall, but out in the country? Because that support, if you're listening to what Jane's been saying, it is quite soft in some areas, isn't it?
Well, look, we're not complacent. That's genuinely true. Look, if I told you we don't pay attention to opinion polls, of course we do, and that news broke last night. I think what is actually more significant, and this is very different to say the poll lead Labour had before the 2015 election, is look at the issues facing the country and what the public think of those, and then look where Labour is. So Labour leading on the economy, Labour leads on immigration. This is quite significant. And just on the push and pull, look, Tony Blair was an election-winning machine. You know, the Conservatives' incompetence on the economy around Black Wednesday, that helped a lot. It's always the both factors. A Conservative Party that is incompetent on the economy, and it is, that will help us. But the vision we put forward at this conference is positive, is substantial, it's long-term, it's not just tactical, and that is important too.
Is Jonathan right, Jane?
Is Jonathan right to say that Labour, you know, I mean, I think what people need to understand, they need to understand what who is the Labour Party pitching its appeal to? And of course, so much has changed. You know, in 2019 we saw, well, it's younger voters or it's voters in cities. And, you know, does Labour now have a message that reaches out to parts of the country that used to vote for the Labour Party before? Does Labour have a message that reaches out in Scotland and that builds on Labour's, you know, relative successes in Wales? You know, we haven't yet seen the answer to that.
I think we are developing it. And for someone like me from a northern working class background, to see a Labour leader and a Labour Party which is happy to talk about why people, yes, should own their own home, have a good job, have job security, is proud and comfortable with the country we seek to represent. These are all the things. I call that classic Labour, not new Labour or old Labour. I think Keir has gathered and encapsulated that on a scale which is exactly what I want the Labour Party to be. And the fact is, if you want in this country the kind of prosperity which people deserve and the kind of public services that they deserve, you can't have the Conservatives. I mean, the verdict, I think, is clear from that mini-budget on Friday. This is the plan the country needs. It's the fresh start with Labour we need.
But Jay mentioned Scotland and those seats that had been Labour for decades and then went to the Conservatives in 2019. There is still a mountain to climb there, isn't there?
No, the scale of the 2019 defeat, let's be clear, if we were to win the next election, it would be unprecedented in British political history to turn around a result. A revival on that scale would be something very special indeed. But crucially, we've got a very simple message to voters in Scotland. If you want a Labour government, vote Labour.
Right. I mean, Ben, in terms of the issues, I was talking to people here yesterday, people who did support a more Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell style prospectus, particularly on the economy. And they were saying maybe now Keir Starmer can be more radical. Maybe he could move slightly further back into that territory because of the position of the Conservative Party.
I think it's, for me, it's about, before you get to the policies, it's about what's the argument. What is the argument we want to make running into 2024? And I think that argument has got to be about change and it's got to be about the economy. Then you can start fleshing out with the policies the closer you get to the election. But at the moment, the public aren't looking for detailed policy at the moment. They're trying to work out, OK, if you are serious, what is the argument you're going to be making? And does that resonate?
Do you think that's the case?
I think, you know, if, as a member of the public, you know, what has happened over kind of recent years has just been so much change, so much volatility, so many tumultuous events. And clearly, you know, what voters want is they want economic competence, they want a party that represents them, that stands for them, and, you know, they want to not look down the barrel of a winter where they're worried about their personal finances and becoming poorer. And this is a terrible context.
I agree with that. Also, as a member of the public as well, I would also say I see that the fact that the government has accepted this principle. Labour announced a freeze on energy bills through a windfall tax. Imagine talking about a couple of years ago about talking freezing everyone's energy bills across the country. That is bold politics and that is bold policy. So I think he is setting out bold alternatives. But crucially at this point of the election cycle, it's about winning the argument, making yourself seem credible and looking to that next election.
Kate, how worried are Conservative MPs, if they are at all, about their jobs?
With this poll, I mean, this poll, huge poll for Labour, obviously it will send Tory MPs nervous. I mean, I was speaking to some this morning. You've obviously had this budget, you've had the pound slide, and it is a worrying time. Now, some, I think, are saying, if you're a true kind of trust believer, you're holding your nerve, you're saying the markets you need to give it some time, the markets will settle down, you need to see through the next few weeks. Even if you're a trust sceptic on the Tory backbenches, I think they're still thinking, let's see where this goes, because the last thing they want to do is engage in another bout of civil war, talk about leadership challenges. It would just send this market spiralling.
And what about the, as the poll indicates, a resurgent Labour Party? You know, sort of conversely to, as you say, the market news, what about Keir Starmer's Labour Party in the minds of Tory MPs?
Well, Tory MPs don't want to lose their jobs, right? So they will be nervous about this poll. They'll be nervous about a resurgent Labour Party. I think that if you're looking at Labour, I would say, and some of those Conservative MPs would say, you've got a lot of work to do to rebuild trust in your old heartlands. And it's not just about having a good criticism of the current government or fiscal responsibility. It's about aspiration. What's your positive vision?
Yes, well, the offering a critique, of course, at some point closer to an election, Labour will no doubt be setting out more of those policies. Jane, before you go, Jonathan responding to questions about lack of seats in Scotland and to some extent in those northeast former heartlands. Conference voted yesterday here in favour of proportional representation at general elections. Is there polling as to how Labour would fare if that were to happen?
So this is fascinating to me, to see the debate about PR, because, you know, there's so many claims made about the effects of PR. Now, clearly, it depends on where the voters stand and who the voters like at a given time. So PR could have benefited the Labour Party if the Labour Party was in a coalition with other progressive parties over recent years, where the Labour Party hasn't looked like it was on course for a majority. Of course, now you get to the point where, well, if Labour thinks it can win a majority, then it's more likely to govern alone under first past the post. So, of course, it depends on the popularity of the parties. Not that's the true, you know, that's just a kind of most obvious thing to say. But it's, you know, it's therefore puts Labour in this kind of interesting position, because just at the moment where they look like they might be able to form a government on their own, the party wants a more proportional system. Now, that's in the short term, and that's if you're only thinking about elections and election results. And, you know, if you're just thinking, you know, there's lots of other wider arguments for more proportional systems, lots of arguments around, you know, the likely effects on voter satisfaction and the representation, the link between your vote counting more, you know, the likelihood that your vote then, your express preferences get represented more often. So there are other arguments for PR, but of course they don't just benefit Labour, they can also benefit the right. It depends on what the voters...
Which of course is what happened in European elections. It also benefited the right at the European Parliament.
The things that passed at conference don't automatically become
Labour
policy, but you've got to understand the delegates who are voting for this. They're not doing it because they think it's in Labour's short-term advantage. They want a better political system. Look how the political system has failed. Look how bad the last 12 years have been. Let's be clear, the places that voted Conservative in 2019 would not have done so if it was the agenda we saw last Friday from Liz Truss. So it's absolutely right for people to want a better political system, because that's how you get the better economy and country we need.
We're going to talk a little bit more about proportional representation and electoral reform later on in the programme. Goodbye to you, Jane Green. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's talk about the economy, because as everyone has been saying here, that is front and centre stage for the political parties across the board. Let's just show you the reaction here in the Financial Times. Bank of England and Treasury fail to calm market nerves over UK finances. That's Andrew Bailey and, of course, Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor. You can see underneath there two graphs, the yellow lines there. The one on the left is showing how the pound has plummeted over the last few days versus the dollar. It has stabilised a little bit today compared to yesterday morning. On the right, though, perhaps is even more important. That is a graph representing the cost of government debt, the cost of borrowing two-year gilts. The yield on that has shot up. Let's talk to Darshini David, the BBC's economics correspondent, about exactly what is entailed in those two graphs in just a moment, actually. I'm going to just show you a couple of the other papers. In the Eye, we can show you the headline, New Mortgages Blocked Amid UK Market Turmoil. That's the impact, of course, on everybody who is a home owner. And finally, in the Daily Telegraph, the headline there says, Spooked lenders ditch new mortgages in pound chaos. I think Darshini David is there now for us. Darshini, hello to you.
Hello, what a day.
Hello.
Once again.
Yeah, indeed, another dramatic day. So the pound has stable, as I said, a little bit against the dollar. But what has happened to the cost of borrowing for the government?
This is an absolutely fascinating one because, as you say, we are seeing a calmer day for those markets, both the value of sterling and indeed that interest rate on new government borrowing, what we call bond yields, gilt yields, that has stabilised somewhat. But as you say, this isn't about what's happening in the markets at the moment. That turmoil we've seen on trading floors in the last few days is making its presence felt already across the economy. And if we zone in on those borrowing costs for the government, at one point yesterday, it was more expensive for our government to borrow, to fund spending on things like public services, than it was for governments in Spain or Italy. Just think about that. And when we look at those movements in rates over the last few days, the rates on government borrowing, we are talking perhaps about the addition of £15 billion to the government's interest costs. They are already set to top £100 billion next year. That means there's less money to go around. When you're talking about tax cuts, when you're talking about hospitals or schools, it has to come out of somewhere. And as you say, the other thing we have to look at when we talk about borrowing costs, mortgages. This lunchtime, we're seeing more and more lenders saying because of the way interest rates are expected to rise, they're withdrawing products, perhaps temporarily, but perhaps we are going to see some pain. All of this happening at a time, of course, when households are under immense pressure.
Darshini, David, thank you very much for bringing us right up to date. Let's talk about the cost of borrowing, Jonathan, because the government is going to be borrowing this year and in the future. To the extent you can see here, we can show our viewers £190 billion in 22-23. Even in a couple of years' time, though, you can see it's still going to be very high. That is after the cap on energy bills comes to an end. It's still going to be around £100 billion a year. And a big part of that extra long-term borrowing is because of all those tax cuts that the government announced on Friday, many of which Labour supports. So roughly speaking, how much lower would borrowing be under Labour?
Let's be clear. First of all, everyone in this country is poorer, every one of us, because of what Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss did on Friday. It's not just the individual measures that has caused a reaction as severe as that. This government's position is you can increase spending, cut taxes, it'll magically be paid for. Who would have thought that would carry no confidence in the financial markets?
But just to let the audience know, viewers know, you are supporting some of those tax cuts. You will stick, rightly or wrongly, to the cut in the basic rate of income tax. You also want to see and back that reversal in national insurance contributions. So you do support an awful lot of that will have to be funded by borrowing. We've just heard from Darshini, David, that the costs are soaring.
Our fiscal rules would not allow for that. We're not going to fall into a trap where they present us as being for higher taxes. The reason taxes are higher is the low growth of the last 12 years. The government are right on that. But let's be clear, our fiscal rules, Rachel Reeves on conference floor yesterday got delegates cheering for the phrase fiscal discipline. Now that shows how realistic not sticking to that discipline is.
All right, well then sticking to your fiscal discipline, as you say, the Shadow Chancellor says, how much lower would borrowing be, just remembering those figures there, under Labour?
Well, you can't put a specific figure on it because...
But it would have to be if you wanted to bring down the cost, or are you going to cut spending?
No, because economic growth, we can have some confidence that our plan will be better than the government's because it's real things like investment in skills, fixing the Brexit deal so it works better, having a long-term industrial strategy. But we're not going to allow... this country needs a fresh start to replace these Tories. We're not going to allow them to portray us as wanting higher taxes when we've got the answer to that. Their position that they've taken, their overall approach to the economy, not just the individual measures, as I say, but the fact that fiscal and monetary policy are completely inconsistent, that is driving the lack of confidence. Our approach is a much more disciplined one, and we would not have those problems that we've seen there.
Right, well, you say that, but we've just got to take your word on it in the way that Liz Truss and
Has any Labour government in history produced a reaction like that?
No,
they haven't.
No, but you may be inheriting those levels of borrowing. That's what I'm trying to say to you. And that actually is what the Institute for Fiscal Studies is saying. Jonathan Reynolds, as Business Secretary, how are you going to bring down that level of borrowing if you are in favour of some of those central tax cuts, the measures that were brought in by the government, unless you're going to cut spending?
No.
And that's what people want to know. You're not going to cut spending on any public services?
No, we're not. And the worry for everyone should be when Kwasi Kwarteng talks about a medium-term financial strategy. Let's be clear, that's what he's talking about. He's trying to restore confidence. That situation there is solely because of this government's approach to the economy, and ours is very different. Look at the historical pattern of borrowing there and where we've been.
How is it different, Jonathan?
Because we would not borrow for day-to-day spending.
Right, but you say that, but actually the IFS has said Labour supports many of the expensive tax cuts that I have just outlined.
Well, we don't support the top rate of tax going, no.
No, you're going to reinstate that. I mean, you've already said how you're going to spend that. You're going to spend that on nurses, aren't you?
And our argument, just to be clear, our argument
not bringing down the deficit.
No, our argument is one of the major economic problems the country faces is having over 5 million people out of work.
Okay.
Investment in health, particularly mental health, will return more people to work, increase the labour supply, and that will have a positive effect on economic growth.
I'm sure, but I come back to this essential point that you say that Labour would not have those figures staring at them if they were in government. You're not going to cut anything from public services. You're still going to have those expensive tax cuts. You're going to spend the money on reinstating the 45 pence higher rate of tax on nurses, not bringing down the deficit. Something's got to give.
No, but what's got to give is a recognition that if economic growth in this country was at the level it was under the last Labour government...
They're going to have economic growth. That's what they're saying. They're going for growth.
Yes, but look at the verdict on that. The verdict is in on that. No confidence across the board. If we return to the level of economic growth under the last Labour government, that is completely sustainable.
So why would the markets believe and be more reassured by a Keir Starmer government than a Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng one?
Well, they can take a look at them, first of all, and they have.
But what is it that's going to differentiate you if
It's
you're
fiscal
doing
risk.
very much the same?
The markets need to know that you will stick to what you are saying. It's not just those individual measures, as I say. The lack of independent OBR analysis of the budget contributed to this. The Chancellor, by the way, not only on Friday with what he said on Saturday morning, further tax cuts coming. That all has undermined confidence. And if you have a government which people have credibility and faith in, which you would have under Rachel and Keir in charge of economic policy, I mean, you honestly have to work quite hard to produce an outcome as bad as that. I'm absolutely serious. A serious developed country like this, which is famed for its debt profile, in other words, people trusted this country for many, many years to borrow on long-term, very preferential rates to the state. It is honestly quite hard to have ruined that, that overnight.
Well, I'm still not convinced about where you would get that higher growth without spooking the markets to some extent with the similar tax cuts and amount of borrowing. But let me just remind myself and viewers, Labour still wants to borrow an extra £28 billion every year to tackle climate change.
Yes, our position on that is very clear. The costs of not tackling climate change are greater than the actions that we want to take to make sure we hit our objectives, but also get positive economic growth and jobs from that.
Is that still sustainable on the basis of the conversation we've just had about borrowing?
Look, you always have to review the conditions, and clearly it's a situation which is changing.
So that could change. That
there's an economic reality and gravity, but fundamentally our plans are about stronger growth, better jobs. That is sustainable. We should have confidence in that, and actually, I would say more than spending cuts, it's our plan that would restore confidence to the markets.
What exactly would you spend that £28 billion a year on?
Well, you have to listen to some parts of Keir's speech that's coming up, but you heard from Ed Miliband about the expansion of offshore wind, of onshore wind, of tidal, of hydrogen power. There are opportunities in things like sustainable aviation fuel that we are looking at. It's not about the state doing all that, by the way. It's about what is this funding required to leverage in the private sector investment, which is huge to tackle climate change, but is out there if the markets, if the investable prospect is put forward to them.
Well, I look forward to hearing in the speech exactly how that money is going to be spent to some extent. Ben, just listening to this conversation, do you accept that a Keir Starmer Labour government, if they win the next election, is going to have a pretty dismal economic backdrop to deal with, and yet aping many of the things that the government is doing and has said?
I certainly accept that what Labour might inherit is going to be really serious, and I think, and the debate you've just had with Johnny is going to be, we're going to be having that debate over and over and over again about how on earth are we going to get to grips with this.
But do you think those things are sustainable then, the £28 billion a year to tackle climate change, the reversal of the national insurance contributions, and also the cutting of the basic rate of income tax? Will that be sustainable under a Labour government?
I think first principle we've got to accept, actually, this crisis isn't over yet. I think this could get worse, and I think history will remember last Friday as an extraordinary moment when the fundamentals in our economy were exposed and the government lost its anchor on the economy. So the truth is, I don't think this crisis is over yet, and this situation could get a lot worse. In terms of how Labour's got to respond and it's got to adapt, I mean, that is for people like Johnny, that's for Keir, that's for Rachel to thrash out. But what Labour could end up inheriting could be deeply, deeply serious. And that is going to require a serious plan to tackle it.
I mean, how bad is this for the Liz Truss quasi-Kwarteng government? We know that the Chancellor is saying, hold fire, as you said, we've got to hold our nerve. But the reaction is clear for everybody to see. How bad do you think it is?
Well, you can't sugarcoat it. This reaction's bad. However, it's true, isn't it, that they were doing something radical. They came out and said, we're tearing up Treasury orthodoxy. We're going to be the great disruptors. And so their argument, and the argument of their backers today, really is, look, we were expecting the market to wobble a bit. Hold our nerve. Well, you've got to see it through. You can't just blink after a day or two. You've got to see where this lands. However, it exposes splits in the parliamentary party, that's for sure.
Well, Kate, can I just get you to react to the headline there on the Daily Mail, fury at the City Slickers betting against UK PLC. And then this ironic tweet, if I could put it like that, from the former Conservative Chancellor, George Osborne, who has tweeted earlier today to say, odd to see free marketeers urging a free market government to ignore the markets.
Bit of shade there, isn't there?
Would you say as well? I mean, the market's not some mystical force.
You're going to get headlines like that. You're going to have Liz Truss backers come out and say, look, these are some people making big money speculating on the markets. I think the issue, it goes back to what you were talking to Johnny about, or Jonathan, sorry. I think the issue here is whose recipe does the public back to grow the economy? Everyone knows our economy is struggling. Everyone knows Britain desperately needs growth. They desperately need greater productivity. Now, like it or not, Liz and Kwasi have given you their recipe. They say we're going to cut taxes, we're going to get new business, that's going to grow the economy. The question for Labour at this Labour conference is, do we trust their recipe? Big question for the voters.
Well, there's the question.
Well,
It's the same question. Why would the markets trust your recipe? We don't quite have the details, your recipe for growth, any more than Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss's.
Because the idea that you can grow the economy by giving tax cuts to the already well-off is completely discredited, and that is the government policy.
You're backing that reversal.
We're not backing the top rate of income tax.
In the national insurance, it's regressive, isn't it? You know, you're going to be benefiting the higher earners more.
We opposed the rise in national insurance on the basis, quite rightly, that if you're going to raise money for the health service and social care, it should come from all sources of income, not just working people who pay through the PAYE system. So it's a consistent position
but
from us.
How are you going to fund it then?
Because we're going to have, look, our recipe
You're going to have growth, but you haven't told me how you're going to get the growth.
Well, I'll tell you, it's industrial strategy, it's fixing business rates, it's improving the relationship with the European Union and the Brexit deal. These are real things that make a difference. Not being kicked out of the Horizon Europe Science Programme. These are real things that make a difference. By the way, letting the OBR look at our budgets and analyse them, not sacking the senior civil servant at the Treasury who handled the last crisis and then giving yourself a new one days later. Look, we talk about the markets like there's some kind of magic force of, all-seeing power. These are just individual people.
You've said, yes, but you said you've never seen anything like it.
But these are individual people making decisions, traders, investors. Many of the people, by the way, who will actually benefit, ironically, from the tax cut, saying, no, this is completely absurd. We have no faith and no trust in it. And the fact that the Conservative Party, and it's not all Conservative MPs, but it is the ones who are in charge at the minute, that their response to this is, we'll just double down, we're not going to listen to anyone. I mean, the business response to this is they're in despair, and that's why they're coming to the Labour side.
Well, you say they're in despair. I mean, we spoke to the Federation of Small Businesses yesterday. They said they liked what they heard on Friday, particularly around tax cuts, probably also around the corporation tax, cancellation of that rise too. They're interested in what Labour has to say as well. But actually, the initial response, certainly from business, was very positive from the CBI on Friday.
I think it was a little diplomatic, but I don't think any business lobby group wants to see the value of sterling go through the floor, the cost of government borrowing going up, with all the ramifications for businesses and individuals and the health of the economy as a whole. I don't think they were in favour of that.
I mean, is Labour going to have to come up quite soon, bearing in mind the sort of backdrop with high inflation and possibly interest rates going up again from the Bank of England, with more concrete proposals on how you get that elusive growth?
I think yes, but I think that's coming, and I think we can expect that to come. I also think just touch on where I think the government is. This is all about confidence. This is about does the market have confidence in the government? I think the silence from both the Prime Minister over recent days and that awful clip of the Chancellor running away.
We showed it yesterday, Kwasi Kwarteng. Well, of course, as he says, which is, I suppose, legitimate in the circumstances, he doesn't want to do anything more to fuel the turmoil.
Well, yeah, but the Chief Secretary for the Treasury was saying on the day of the budget, look, fantastic, look how sterling's going up. And then suddenly sterling crashed and he's decided he's not commenting on the budgets anymore. The optics of it, it's not just, we can talk about the economics and the detail and the policies and the numbers, but talk to most punters out there at the moment. It feels like the government has got no grip and there is no control. And they're seeing that day in, day out, not just with rising inflation, but mortgage rates going up. Everyone is terrified about this at the moment. And so I think that the sense is that the government just hasn't got control and didn't expect this reaction as well. That's the thing. No one thought. The government was not laying the groundwork for this kind of market reaction.
All right, but Ben, you worked with Keir Starmer for quite some time. There will be, to use that hackneyed phrase, tough choices to be made. And it will be tax rises or spending cuts. Is it going to be spending cuts?
Again, that's for Keir, the Shadow Cabinet and Rachel to set out, and I'm not going to preempt that. But what I would say is, as I just said, this debate we've had right now is going to go on day in, day out. So I accept the principle. I'm sorry.
No. Sorry. Don't worry. That's my job.
It is. But it is. We are going to have this debate for 2 years, and so yes, Labour's going to continue having to be asked questions and provide answers to those questions.
I mean, Kate, the problem for any opposition, but I think we've seen it particularly with this Labour Party, is that every policy they come up with, whether it's freezing energy prices, whether it's let's have a windfall tax, taken by the government. They adopt these policies, the windfall tax to a lesser degree, but they still have adopted these policies, which is why opposition are reluctant to set out too clearly what they may want to do in government.
Well, I remember not so long ago a Coburn opposition doling out policies like they were 2 a penny, but it's certainly true that under Keir Starmer they're being much more cautious. I was talking to one, actually Johnny should be able to tell us about this, I was talking to one shadow cabinet minister last night who was telling me the rigorous process you have to do to get your policy through Rachel Reeves. Apparently it's sort of a bit like a tough tutorial or something.
Have you passed?
Well, we've launched our industrial strategy at this conference to fanfare from unions and business, so we did manage to get that through. But look, it's professional. That's what it is. It's professional. No, you can't just go out and say you want to spend X amount of money and not say how you would pay for that, or expect that just to be something that is for your remit alone without wider ramifications for colleagues. I mean, look at the consistency on things like social care, from what I said from the podium to what where Streeting said is the member of the Shadow Cabinet responsible for that element of it. I was talking about the jobs element, he was talking about what it means for health and social care. So, of course, there's got to be a professional process behind it. That's what people should expect. They should expect the same of the government as well, but unfortunately don't get it from them.
All right, well, listen, I said we would go back to electoral reform. This is what happened yesterday. Take a look at this.
Those in favour? And those against? No. That's carried.
Yes, so that happened on conference floor yesterday, backing calls, Labour members for electoral reform. Laura Parker is here from Labour for a New Democracy. You've been campaigning for this change. Explain what it means.
It means that we're going to have a fair election system. We're going to get Labour into government, which the country desperately, desperately needs. And when we get Labour into government, we want them to introduce a proportional system. Very simply put, it just means that everybody's vote counts, no matter where they live. It means that Parliament reflects accurately the votes of the people. And that's really it. And elsewhere around the world, they just call this a fair voting system.
Now, Laura, as you know, it doesn't mean it's adopted, of course, by the Shadow Cabinet or by Keir Starmer. Are you going to look at this and support it?
No, we'll obviously have to discuss it and respond to it. I mean, I think it's, first of all, I pay tribute to Laura and campaigners. I mean, people have got to remember the Labour Party is a bigger political party than all the rest of the political parties in the UK put together. And they come from all parts of the UK and they want to see the chance for Labour representation.
The speech will be extremely busy. If you are a delegate or have a ticket, please ensure to arrive early.
I'm obviously not going to do anything.
Well, we are
The main hall for leader speech will be extremely busy. If you are a delegate or have a ticket, please ensure to arrive early.
Well, I think that's finished. Public service broadcasting at its best. Information being broadcast live across the conference about that speech. You were interrupted just there, sorry.
Yes, I was saying we'll pay tribute to campaigners from all parts of the country who have brought that motion. It's a start of a conversation. We've got to respond to that. I think it is important to say that no one making these arguments is saying that Labour can't win under the existing system. We feel confident of that. But people, you know, it's legitimate for people to want to talk about how our democracy can be improved. I think that's absolutely fair. You can't separate out the health of a democracy from the economy, public services. It's all part of that conversation. And of course, for members in Scotland and Wales, they already have this. That's already how they elect their parliaments.
Are you confident they're really going to discuss it? They might discuss it, the Shadow Cabinet, and then reject it. You know what happened in the past historically. You know, Tony Blair was in conversation and talks, of course, with Paddy Ashdown at the time about it. Then the landslide came and it was shelved.
No, I am confident they are, because I think that, you know, everyone has seen the strength of feeling in the party. We didn't sort of squeak through, you know. We've got well over half of all Labour Party branches support this policy. The big trade unions have come out backing it, and you know, and I completely agree with what Johnny's just said about the country. You know, that Labour's got such a big fix-it job to do now. The Tories are wrecking the economy. We've got to look at democratic reform as part of that. No, I am really confident we'll have a conversation. I think
a conversation is one thing, but actually adopting it. And you said in 2015 that first past the post wasn't fit for purpose. That was 7 years ago. Why don't you go right ahead and adopt this?
Look, I've got on the record strong views about this. I mean, like I grew up in the northeast of England at the time, you know, almost unanimously Labour, and I think it is important that Parliament represents the views of everyone in all parts of the country, and votes count in that way, and that's always been my position. And I see the health of other democracies. You know, like you said, Laura, this is fairly standard stuff. But look, it's a conversation that we have to have. But I recognise, you know, if you look at the different components of the vote, there was widespread support for this.
We're having a conversation, says Jonathan Reynolds. That means they're probably not going to adopt it. Why not? It's what members want. Jonathan Reynolds himself said it wasn't fit for purpose, the current system.
Firstly, we've got to win with the system we've got, and I think that's got to be a big focus at the moment. Ultimately, no, Labour can't change anything from opposition. So if we're going to do something like this, we've got to win. We've got to win with the existing system. My instinct is that at the moment, the thing the country is most worried about at the moment is the state of the economy. They're worried about their mortgages. They're worried about rising food prices.
Yeah.
So I would say Labour's got to just keep talking about the economy at the moment. And, you know, issues such as, I mean, this is what conference is all about, and it's fine to have a conversation, but I think the argument you're going for the country needs to be more about the economy than tweaking our electoral system.
Well, look, the first thing to say is all the people who voted for the vote yesterday are the same people who are going to campaign for that Labour government. So, you know, we completely agree on that. That's why we're all here, you know. People have given up annual leave, they've paid for expensive hotels, terrible venue sandwiches. We're all here because we want a Labour government. In our analysis, and I think all the proof shows, you know, you can't disentangle the state of the economy from your state of democracy. You're not going to have equality, an economic equality, unless you sort out the political inequality. So these things are linked. But of course, I completely agree. Today, what we all want to know is what is the government going to do about the economic crisis? There's no doubt in all of our minds that is a top priority.
But Laura's saying they are linked, the two, that you've got to have electoral democracy at the same time. Andy Burnham, who was sitting on the programme yesterday, but he has said that the current system, that's the Mayor for Greater Manchester, is a hoarding of political power in a very small place in Westminster. Do you agree with that?
I'm not a massive fan of first past the post because I don't think it's a fair voting system. I'm not a massive fan, but what I want Labour to be talking about is the number one issue at the moment.
So you think it's a distraction?
I worry, and I don't mean because I think it's it's a good campaign, and as I said, I've got nervous. I don't particularly like our current voting system, but I fear when these kind of things happen, it becomes a distraction. It looks like Labour's not talking about the number one issue, which is the economy.
Priority for Sun readers?
Absolutely not. I think I don't think I've ever got an email, never a letter about this. Stop navel. This happens at Labour Party conference sometimes. Bit of navel gazing. Gift to your opposition, really. Gift to the Tories if you're talking about PR.
I don't think it's navel gazing to talk about the state of our democracy. And I think we can see the attack that the Conservatives have made, cheered on by some in the press, I would say. I also think this is a massive party. Hundreds of thousands of members. We are capable of talking about more than one thing at once. And it is absolutely true that today what we want to know, and maybe you have an answer, is what is the government going to do about the economic crisis? But once we're in government and we're sorting that out, I think we're going to look at our politics because our politics are broken. They're producing the chaos that we're seeing now.
What do you think, Laura? You remember that when Keir Starmer was elected in 2020, he said, I asked at the beginning of the programme, that the 2017 Jeremy Corbyn manifesto was his foundational document. Now he's going to be quoting and echoing Tony Blair from a speech he made pre-1997. What do you make of that from Keir Starmer? Should he be leaning into Tony Blair or remembering what he based his leadership campaign on, Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto?
Well, perhaps luckily for Keir, I'm not his policy advisor, and I'm definitely here on behalf of the PR campaign. I think he should be taking the best ideas from wherever they come. And the thing that we are all absolutely clear is that none of the best ideas include tax cuts for the rich, bonuses for the bankers, whilst people are getting bills through their doors now, as we speak, that they cannot pay. And there is no doubt in my mind that we're going to hear today a brilliant speech from Keir where he will take the Tories head on about their economic policy, which is failing millions of people around the country. You can put a cigarette paper between us all. Every single Labour member here is going to tell you exactly the same thing on that.
I'm sure they will. But your point actually about the broad church that political parties always like to claim they are, do you not think the current system ensures that broad church rather than a proportional representation that might lead to fracturing?
But this isn't all about the parties. We're talking about the voting system because we want to talk about the people. There are millions of people out there who know their votes don't count. Why? Because they live in places where no one ever knocks on their door. My mum and dad were in a big city for many years. No one knocked on the door. They moved to a small town. They're deluged with leaflets. Suddenly they count. That cannot be right. But that's all we're saying. It's not complicated.
It's not complicated, it's very simple. That's all for today. Thank you to all of my guests. It's getting busy. Did I say that's all for today? We've got another programme, of course, in 45 minutes. I almost forgot the big speech. Do join us here at 1:45 on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer for more Politics Live. Bye-bye.